Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and we're back with another Total War Warhammer video. Today we're going to have a discussion regarding naval battles in Total War Warhammer. This will in turn lead into its own series regarding faction focuses and so on. It's something I promised last year, but I'll be very honest, I needed to get my hands on a certain few books, so it took a while. The topic concerning naval battles is quite hot, not only for Total War Warhammer, but for the future of the Total War series. It's a mechanic which was unfortunately removed in later games. Well, for obvious reasons. There were some implementation issues, and it was extremely clunky. That being said, it has been a few years, probably enough time for Creative Assembly to start re-looking at how the mechanics would work and try and perfect them for future titles. The topic regarding the possibility of naval battles in the Total War Warhammer series has recently popped up again due to the loss of license for Man-O-War Corsair, which is a game based on naval warfare in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. Now, before anything, those two things were not linked. Just because Man-O-War existed doesn't mean that Creative Assembly couldn't work on naval combat. The licenses are completely different, where the games themselves are so radically different that obviously there is no issue in terms of licensing. So what we're going to do is divide this video into parts, and hopefully I can figure out how to do this whole timestamp thing on YouTube so you can check out the stuff which is more relevant to you. First, is there demand? In theory, yes. The topic of naval battles appears on social media every now and then. Not so much as, say for example, Cathay, Kislev or a full world map, but it does appear every now and then, and it does generate a lot of conversation. Creative Assembly are indeed aware of this, and it's very possible that Games Workshop are too. Naval battles were very hit and miss in other Total War games. Some of them were absolutely fantastic, or as well as it could be for a Total War game, whereas others were just downright abysmal, and even I can say that myself. I believe it's only a matter of time until we see the revival of naval combat mechanics in the Total War series. It could be for Warhammer or a future title, but it just seems like something so old into the series should eventually make its return. And if it does make its return through Warhammer, well, it could be quite beneficial for Games Workshop and Creative Assembly. For Creative Assembly, this would allow for the return of a rather old mechanic which is kinda missed in my opinion, whilst also allowing for the developers to experiment with new factors only available in Warhammer. I'm of course talking about the implementation of monsters, flying units and magic. These are already baseline mechanics in Total War Warhammer, but would have different functionality in regards to naval combat. Whereas for Games Workshop, this could possibly act as a way to promote a future tabletop game. Games Workshop used to have a lot of minigames back in the day, and eventually they were all axed. However, in more recent times, we've been seeing the return of many of these games. So who's to say that Games Workshop might not be thinking about the return of Man-O-War in either Age of Sigmar or in Warhammer the Old World? Having naval combat in Total War Warhammer, which is by far their most popular Warhammer fantasy game to date, would probably be the best way to cross-promote. If you've seen the ships in-game and used them for a while, you might be inclined to buy the miniature. Games Workshop used to do a similar thing with the actual tabletop minis and those available in Total War Warhammer, where you used to be able to go on gamesworkshop.com, type out Total War Warhammer, and any of the miniatures that were available in-game and are also available in store would pop up. This now moves us on to our next point. Is there source material? And of course the answer is yes. Man-O-War was a tabletop game that was released in the 90s. It only had around a 5-year lifespan, but even then that's still longer than some other minigames. The game itself was expanded upon quite decently so, with some extra supplements and so on, which introduced various races into the format. Through these books, we were introduced to various different ships for most of the races available in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. There were not a lot of miniatures for each race, however this was expanded upon through the expansions as I said, and also through the introduction of special rules. The books, and obviously the miniatures themselves, show off how the ships would actually look in Total War Warhammer, with the books also detailing what special rules these ships would have and how exactly they would work. It also went into detail on how to use certain monstrous units, flying units, and magic. Which brings us into our next section, the races themselves. Not every race was implemented into Man O' War. The rather short lifespan of around 5 years for the series made sure that some of them were just missing. However, I can confirm to you the races that were indeed implemented. These of course are the Empire, Bretonnia, Dwarfs, High Elves, Dark Elves, Orcs and Goblins, Chaos, which was a mixture of Warriors of Chaos and Beastmen, and also got divided into separate sub-factions for each of the Chaos gods, Chaos Dwarves, Skaven, Norse, yes, Norska actually had a army list in this game, and finally the pirate fleets of Sartosa. Of course, as you may have noticed, there are some missing races. The Wood Elves, Ogres, Lizardmen, Vampire Counts, and Tomb Kings. The Vampire Counts and the Tomb Kings, however, were expanded upon ever so slightly in the game known as Dreadfleet, which is where we saw the introduction mostly of the Vampire Coast. So in theory, the three undead factions, Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings, and Vampire Coast, would also have some source material, just not as much as the ones from Man O' War. Each of the new races wouldn't need that many new units. Possibly just the 3 or so added in Man O' War, and then 1 or 2 extra in the form of transports. Let's use Total War Attila here as an example, where you have 2 different types of naval fleets. One, your actual navy, which will have your specialized ships. Everything going around proper naval combat will be there. Your special ships involving siege weaponry, magic, monsters, and so on. Whereas your second type of army would purely be just a fleet of transports. This is of course your main land army, which you've taken to the seas so you may travel to some target. The transport fleet would not have its complete functionality. The majority of your units would still work as normal. Footmen, archers, characters and so on would be able to use the ships as normal, board enemy ships, and so on. However, certain monsters would have to stay in ship cargo. They wouldn't be able to be used in a ship battle. Some monsters will still be able to be used, but let's expand upon this further. First, let's look towards flying units. Flying units should work exactly the same way as they currently do in Total War Warhammer. The benefit of them starting each battle already in the air means that their functionality stays exactly the same way. For this reason, flying units should not only be recruitable by standard armies, but also by naval armies, as this would possibly be the best way to act as a shock troop for the naval armies. As ships themselves are very much a moving platform, almost as if they were a moving wall, then flying units would be able to attack the ships pretty much like they attack walls. They'll just drop right in and do their damage. It's not like they would be too overpowered here, as of course they can easily get trapped and killed off. Now we'll look towards monsters. And this part is a rather important topic, as many people use monsters as a reason not to include naval battles in Total War Warhammer. The majority of the monsters in the series wouldn't be able to be used in naval combat, this much we know. Monsters such as rogue idols, hellpit abominations and so on, well, they would sink, and it's not like they would be able to man a ship themselves. This much is true. A simple fix here, however, would be the implementation of 2 different types of transport ships. The transports, of course, would be for your land armies, which would instantly become available to you as soon as you moved a land army into the ocean. The first type would be the basic transport ship. This is the one that carries your infantry, your characters, and so on. All the ones that you would imagine would be manned by a unit of entities. The second type of transport would be the monster transports, or cage ships as I'd like to call them. So these themselves would have your monstrous units in transport ships, however you would not be able to use them in combat. They would be in the decks below, being tended to until they can be unleashed if you make landfall. Until then, you would have a rather basic crew of some naval units, probably just some tier 1 unit or tier 2, which would take their stead until you would make landfall. Yes, I know this sounds a little complicated, but take into account how artillery currently works in the Total War series. It's technically two forms of entities, isn't it? The crew and the actual weaponry. So how this would work in terms of monstrous units would be, whilst you're controlling monsters in naval battles and you're nowhere near land, you would be using your basic units that would be manning the ships. This crew would do everything every other crew would do. You would be able to just move the ship around, board enemy ships, with the crew then jumping onto the enemy ship, and so on and so forth. However, should that ship make landfall, then things would be entirely different. That ship crew would not join the battlefield at all. Instead, as soon as it reaches landfall, the monsters would be unleashed, and the ships, like every other transport in other Total War games, would then make its merry way backwards and disappear from the battlefield. I think something like this would work very well. Of course, there could also be some monsters that could be used in both transport and naval armies. These would be the ones that we know are aquatic, so for example the Caribis for the Dark Elves and so on, where maybe in the future we could see the implementation of other aquatic based monsters, like for example the Merworm, the Basilisk, and a few others. Now let's move on to magic. So magic did feature in Man O' War, and was pretty much the same as it was on the tabletop. Yes, there were some differences, but the general gist more or less remains the same. So it can be assumed that in Total War Warhammer, the functionality would pretty much stay the same. There's not really too much to talk about here. Instead, we'll expand upon the wizards, and in truth characters in general, you know, your basic heroes and lords, in our next point. So characters in Total War Warhammer are single entities, which might be the most difficult thing to work around in regards to naval combat. Wizards, captains, and generic lords, even named legendary lords, they all act on their own. This isn't like the older Total War titles where the characters would be with their own specific unit. However, there is a possible workaround, once again taking inspiration from the artillery in Total War Warhammer, as they are two separate groups of entities, yet when working together, for example the crew trying to fire off one of the cannons and so on, they are two entities working in unison. So with that logic, it could work in a similar sense to how I explained how monstrous ships could work in terms of transport, where while on the ocean, the characters would be supported by a crew. However, the moment the ship made landfall, well, that would change up everything. The crew would stay on the ship and drive off, whilst the character would move on his own accord. While this does sound a bit strange, well, it can be justified, considering the fact that no one character would be able to man a ship by him or herself. I think something like that would be an easy workaround. Next, we'll talk about recruitment. So of course, transport armies would work as normal. These are your normal ground-based armies, but as soon as you take them to the oceans, they will have their own ships, just basic transports, nothing special there. However, your naval armies on the other hand, would only be able to be recruited through port cities, of course. Port settlements would then be changed a little bit. All new naval units, that specifically which would only be allowed in the water, would be available to recruit from the ports. There are usually 3 tiers in port cities, in Tier 1, Tier 3, and Tier 5. In all honesty, that's pretty much enough to add in for everything. Tier 1 would have basic ships, Tier 3, which in minor settlements would be the final one, would have some stronger ships, and finally Tier 5 would have all the big ones. In the coming days, we'll of course have some faction focuses for each race, and that would then highlight all the different types of possible ships. If we go by Man o' War and Dreadfleet, of course there'll have to be a few extra implemented by Creative Assembly for races which had no naval combat. Well, there's honestly just enough to be able to fit everything into just one building. Of course, the port cities themselves would have to have access to a special new type of lord. This would be the respective fleet masters for all the different races. These would only be able to be recruited in cities that have a port, very similar to how you require certain buildings to unlock certain heroes. So the mechanics involved are already in place in game. And lastly, when could this be implemented? Naval combat hasn't been confirmed for Warhammer 3, and unless Creative Assembly outright say it's never going to happen, there's always a possibility. So should they ever look towards implementing naval combat into the game, it would most likely be in Warhammer 3. This makes sense the most, of course, and it should only be implemented with the following circumstances. First, we need to see the mega mortal empires come out, as naval combat would make the most sense there. Here's hoping this is more or less as close to a full world map as we can see, with that itself having large bodies of water, so we'd need to have some sort of system in place. Island battles are cool and all, but they get extremely boring because the maps are not that varied. It just gets kinda tedious. Plus, it makes no sense for two armies to meet each other in the middle of an ocean and go, yeah, let's all meet up in this island and fight here. That's always been a big issue of mine. So rant aside, it should be implemented after the mega mortal empires, and after the last race pack has been implemented. That way, this could then be implemented with every race in mind. This would then mean that naval combat would itself be an expansion-sized DLC, where purchasing it would unlock naval units for every single race available in the Total War Warhammer series. There's a few important things to talk about here. First off, as this would be a DLC late into the series, there is no fear that this would take away from a siege overhaul, a faction overhaul, or even the implementation of other races into the game. Second off, this could be marketed as an optional form of DLC, and what I mean by this is that you don't really need this DLC. Obviously they won't market it as that because that would be extremely stupid, but you know what I mean. Where you don't need the naval combat DLC to still enjoy Total War Warhammer, and you can buy it whenever you wish. If you don't have the DLC, then the other races and factions will not get access to the units only available through it. Obviously it would be kinda broken if everyone else had it and you didn't. Now, how this could also work is an optional toggle system. After you've purchased the DLC and you're running a new campaign, if you don't want to actually deal with naval combat, well, at the start of your campaign, very much in the same sense as how you deal with the Chaos Invasion where you could just turn it off, that could also be a toggleable feature. It's just something that simple, where you could have the DLC, maybe you enjoy it with certain races and factions, but with others it's just not your type of play, so you could easily have that removed. I think that's covered everything in a baseline form. Of course, in the coming days, should you guys be interested, I'd be more than willing to expand upon this series further. I'm hoping to do some faction focuses for all the different races and factions, so let me know if that's something of interest in the comments below, as it does help me gauge viewer interest. I know the topic of naval combat is pretty much like beating a dead horse, but I really want to see naval combat in Total War Warhammer. This is just a personal want in all honesty because, well, Total War Warhammer is the biggest representation of Warhammer Fantasy since Warhammer Fantasy itself. No video game has ever gotten to this sheer scope and scale for Warhammer Fantasy. I mean, let's be honest, it's probably one of the biggest Warhammer games in general. But with all that said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and let's start a bit of a discussion. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.